Namaskar, greetings, welcome to CEC lecture. The topic for lecture is gender equality, special focus on gender and development, understanding historical trajectory of 4 UN Women World Conferences. Dear learners, in this lecture, we shall have a special discussion on the 4 United Nations Women World Conferences. As we look at the 4 UN Women World Conferences, we shall also map down, understand the trajectory of issues of gender and development, and above all, look at the big picture of gender equality, that how gender equality has witnessed, the concept has witnessed changes, new developments, and we shall reflect on these changes with respect to issues concerning development amongst others. Moving forward, we all know that male and female, the biological differences are differentiated. However, biology, when it is translated in the form of a social construct, biology plays an important role in gendered behavior. The extent of its impact on gender roles puts forward the question mark, and this becomes the matter of debate, that how biology, when it is understood or interpreted, put forward as a social construct, therein gender becomes a matter of debate. Gender, going by the important definition from the World Health Organization, gender is about characteristics of women, men, girls and boys that are socially constructed. Gender includes norms, behaviors and roles. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society. Further, as a social construct, gender can change over time. These are the important inputs that we read from the World Health Organization. Moving forward, as we understand gender as characteristics of women, men, girls, boys, and that gender is socially constructed. Further, that gender includes norms, behaviors and roles. It varies from society to society and it can change over time. This put forward the important argument, that is gender equality. Now, we all know that by nature, man and women are equal. Gender equality speaks about inherent equality between men and women. To say gender equality then is also looking at the extent to which national cultures support women's developments and achievements. Reading from the important work by Linus and Croft. Now, let us look at gender equality through the perspective of development, and this brings us towards the issue of the important issue, that is, we need to look at the economic side. What do we understand by economy? Economy, it is a system of production, distribution, consumption of goods and services. Further, as a system of production and consumption activities that determines how resources are allocated amongst all its participants. So, when we look at gender equality, gender and development has an important bearing. As we understand the definition of economy, system of production, distribution and consumption of goods and services, let us now look at that how economy too has witnessed transition. For example, we talk about main types of economic system, namely traditional economic system, capitalist economy, socialist economy, mixed economy. And when we talk about economic system, that is the means that are adopted by governments of respective countries for their distribution of resources along with services and goods. Traditional economic system that we talk about, that is wherein there is little specialization or that there is division of labor. The command economic system, that is often understood as socialist economic system, controlled by the government. Example of that, the planning methods. Further, market economic systems involves less government interference. Market forces regulate demand and supply. Mixed economic system, a combination of features of both socialist and free market economic system, and the mixed economic system is also known as a dual system. Now, when we look at these various types of economic system, gender and development examines specifically that how social constructs play an important role in development issues as well as in the bigger setup of the economy. Why it becomes important to understand? That is the gender bearing on development issues, on economic models. That is, there is a need to understand the important structures that have a bearing on both men as well as women. So, gender issues demand a comprehensive analysis. Now, when we talk about gender and development, let us understand that when we look at the global governance framework, when we look at issues of global governance, the United Nations Decade for Advancement of Women was there from 1975 to 1985. Now, we all know about the primacy, the prevalence, the significance of the realist discourse in international relations. So, gender issues came up in global governance narrative a little later, and this is why when we look at that how it was the era of 1970s that talked about gender and development issues. The first UN Women's Conference was held in Mexico City in 1975. It designated 1975 to 1985 as the UN Decade for Women. Now, again, this is very important because what we see here is that there were 133 delegations from member states, and 113 out of which, if we go by the records, were headed by women. So, the first United Nations Women's Conference held in Mexico City in 1975, it made an important call. It was an important milestone. 3 objectives were identified in relation to equality, peace and development for the decade. So, let us go by the archives, the historical records from United Nations to understand the 3 objectives, that is full gender equality, elimination of gender discrimination, integration and full participation of women in development, increased contribution by women towards strengthening world peace. Now, this becomes important to be understood that 1970s is the time when the world is divided as a bipolar unit of Cold War between capitalism to communism at one hand and capitalism at the other hand. And in that framework, 1970s witnessed a new perspective, that is the United Nations Decade for Advancement of Women from 1975 to 1985. Moving forward, United Nations has organized 4 world conferences on women. This becomes important to understand, dear learners, to map down the historical trajectory of understanding gender through the lens of development. Now, the issues concerning gender equality or factors impacting gender equality have also witnessed changes with time. So, understanding the United Nations 4 world conferences on women with respect to what was the agenda, the objectives become significant to map down gender and development through an important historical trajectory. So, the first conference was in Mexico City in 1975, the second conference in Copenhagen in 1980, the third conference in Nairobi 1985 and the fourth conference in Beijing in 1995. So, this is an important picture that we get from the United Nations UN Women Conference, and when we look at that how the world conferences of United Nations Decade, the second conference, as we go towards the first we just saw the first Mexico conference. Now we go towards understanding the second UN Women World Conference. So, the World Conference of United Nations Decade for Women, that is from 14 to 30th July 1918 at Copenhagen, Denmark. Three spheres in which measures for equality, development and peace were needed. And again, let's look at the archives, the historical inputs from United Nations, that what were the important areas that were pointed out? Equal access to education, equal access to employment opportunities, equal access to adequate health care services. So, we see that with time, the agenda concerning gender and development within the framework of global governance narrative is witnessing new inputs. Moving forward, dear learners, the World Conference of the United Nations Decade for Women, 14 to 30th July 1918, Copenhagen, Denmark. In this conference, there was review and appraisal of progress achieved during the past 5 years, indicating that the integration of women into development has been formally accepted by most governments as a desirable planning objective. And again, this becomes very important that 1980s is the time when the world is gradually moving towards the witness of perhaps dilution of the tensions of the Cold War. In this framework, all of this UN Women Conference becomes important, that how the agenda of development is being broadened, how incorporation of gender issues into development talks about adopting a holistic, comprehensive framework. The World Conference to review and appreciate the achievements of United Nations Decade for Women from 15 to 26 July 1985 was held in Nairobi, Kenya. This marked the end of the United Nations Decade for Women that was there, and it recognized that gender equality was not an isolated issue, but that gender equality encompassed all areas of human activity. This conference also put forward the idea that it was necessary for women to participate in all spheres, not only in those relating to gender. So, what we see here is that once again with time, there is broadening of the agenda, and that further that gender equality cannot be understood in vacuum. Gender equality demands that gender concerns are understood in a holistic, comprehensive framework with respect to other factors also. The Nairobi strategy stated that, and we quote from there, that despite the considerable progress achieved and the increasing participation of women in society, the decade has only partially attained its goals and objectives. Although the earlier years of the decade were characterized by relatively favorable economic conditions in both developed and the developing countries. Deteriorating economic conditions that have slowed efforts directed towards promoting the equal participation of women in society and have given rise to new problems. With regard to development, there are indications that in some cases, although the participation of women is increasing, their benefits are not increasing proportionately. So, therefore, this also needs to be understood, that how the challenges of that time were highlighted in this conference, and one also has to look at that how far these challenges have been overcome. Moving forward to 1995, and herein we have a picture from the Beijing UN World Conference from the archives of United Nations Women. And when we look at the UN Women Conference and look at the agenda, herein the important highlight were the 12 critical areas. As you can see that on the screen, that these 12 critical areas demand a deeper analysis, that how gender and development and the related issue of gender equality needs to be seen in a very comprehensive framework. Moving forward, dear learners, that when we look at the 4th World Conference on Women, 4 to 15 September 1995, Beijing, China, it was a significant turning point for the global agenda for gender equality. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was there. It was adopted unanimously by 189 countries. This also, later becomes an important global policy document on gender equality. So, what we see here is that over the years from 1975 to 1995, there has been significant enhancement of the agendas that are involved in the bigger picture of gender equality, and that further there has been increase in participation also by respective nation states, and that the agenda of development has been put forward in a broad framework beyond the binaries by the issue of gender. This very important 4th World Conference on Women at Beijing, China, it also set strategic objectives and actions for the advancement of women and achievement of gender equality in 12 critical areas of concerns. Yes, we just saw that the 12 critical areas of concern, and let's understand them. Women and poverty, education and training of women, women and health, violence against women, women and armed conflict, women and the economy, women in power and decision making, institutional mechanism for advancement of women, human rights of women, women and the media, women and the environment, and the girl child. So, seen in this framework, when we look at the important perspectives put forward by the 12 critical areas and the important work done in the realm of gender equality. So, therefore, when we talk about gender equality, and as we just understood it through a historical trajectory of looking at the development perspective from the gender lens, why, to answer the question, why gender equality matters? Because it empowers humanity. Further, economies grow faster when we factor in the gender concerns. So, what is required is the need to reconnect, the need to regenerate, and above all, amplify solidarity with all the commitments made. Now, recently, when we look at the issue of gender perspectives, gender equality, looking at the big framework of gender and development, as we just rightly understood the 12 critical areas of concern put forward in the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, from women and poverty, education and training of women, women and health, violence against women, women and the armed conflict, women and the economy, women in power and decision making, institutional mechanism for advancement of women, human rights of women, women and the media, women and the environment, the girl child. Now, in all these critical areas, in all this important declaration, when we look at the global governance narrative with reference to gender and development, there has been an important innovative approach. So, therefore, where we all know that yes, gender equality is important for empowerment of humanity, for adding an inclusive holistic framework towards economic growth and welfare. So, as we talk about regenerating, reconnecting, amplifying support for all the commitments in this aspect, when we talk about the G20 presidency of 2023, wherein India had the presidency, the call for embracing equity, in the bigger framework of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. So, seen in this framework, when we talk about the G20 declaration, which talked about women led development, in this framework, this important document of the G20 New Delhi Declaration talking about women led development, each and every of its clause, from looking at climate change to looking at digitalization to looking at the need for safety and security, points out that how over the time gender is important. And in this framework, women-led development is presenting an important transformative approach towards understanding economic issues. So again, women-led development tries to look at gender issues through a holistic framework. It tries to bring in climate change, it tries to look at nutritional safety and security, it also looks at other dynamics with respect to workforce safety amongst others. So seen in this broad framework of the G20 declaration on the women-led development, indeed it is talking about enhancing economic and social empowerment, bridging the gender digital divide, driving gender inclusive climate action, securing women food security, nutrition and well-being. So seen in this framework, the issue of gender equality needs to be understood in a very holistic framework. So dear learners, when we talk about gender equality, it has to be seen with respect to issues concerning development also. Now, we all know that characteristics of both men and women, the biological characteristics are different. Norms, behaviors, roles, however, then are attributed based on these biological differences. So, seen in this perspective, economy, development too demands analysis. So when we look at it, how consumption, production, distribution, that determines how resources are allocated amongst all its participants. In this framework, gender issues demand interrogation. So this is why looking at gender equality through the framework of development, gender and development becomes important, because it is important to underline and understand important structures that impact both men and women. The agenda of global governance has come a long way to United Nations Decade for Advancement of Women 1975 to 1985, to the 4 UN World Conferences, to India's significant call to the world for women-led development. So in this framework, one has to look at issues concerning gender equality, ensuring and integrating full participation of women in all development sphere, and above all looking at education, employment, healthcare services, many of the dimensions that impact development, because today the perspectives on development demand a deeper analysis. So gender equality too as a concept, as a concern, has come a long way from, and in this the goals and objectives too demand a right balance with respect to changing concerns of society at large. Dear learners, dear viewers, we hope that the lecture presented to you important inputs and insights for the topic of gender equality seen from the historical trajectory of gender and development. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.